A welfare check leading police to a trail of blood. 3 law enforcement sources familiar with the investigation say officers sent to check on residents at this Los Angeles home found blood and then broke in through a glass door on Monday afternoon, discovering a man and a woman dead inside. NBC News confirms the victims are American Idol music supervisor Robin Kaye and her husband Thomas Deluca, both age 70. The couple found in separate rooms. Both appeared to have been shot in the upper body, according to the law enforcement sources, who say they found Kaye in the home's pantry and her husband in the bathroom. Police were called to that same house last Thursday after reports of a prowler.
My renter saw somebody hopping the fence, but that was back on Thursday. She called 911, but we didn't hear anything since then.
Police now believe the murders took place that same day, but found no signs of forced entry at the time. The investigation later revealed the suspect entered the home through an unlocked door. And a 22-year-old man is in custody tonight. Those charges are pending. American Idol saying Kaye was loved and respected and will forever be in their hearts.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.
What dark secret hides behind silence? In Encino, California, dawn breaks over a serene suburban paradise, but beneath this calm lies an unimaginable nightmare. On July 14, 2025, the silence shattered with the devastating discovery in the once lively home of Robin Kaye and Thomas Deluca. Their celebrated lives in the American Idol universe collided with brutal tragedy. Robin Kaye, whose musical oversight graced over 200 American Idol episodes, was a creative force fueling countless dreams. Her husband, Thomas Deluca, a passionate musician, provided the rhythm to their shared life. Together, they had filled their home with melody and laughter, a testament to a life worshipping art and inspiration. But that morning, their harmonious world was cruelly extinguished. 4 days of unanswered calls and growing concern led to a welfare check that exposed a sinister scene. The door was left unlocked and the alarm disabled, as if inviting something malevolent into their sanctuary. Inside, an eerie silence prevailed, punctuated only by a faint metallic scent intertwined with the delicate aroma of fresh flowers. The juxtaposition was haunting, a home that held joyful memories now tainted by cold, violent stillness. The shock rippled through a community once enamored by the duo's brilliance. In the lingering quiet, questions multiply and hearts break. As the investigation unfolds, we invite you to explore the dark unraveling of this mystery, where celebrity genius met a fate too cruel to imagine. Unravel the story. Witness the tragedy. Learn the truth that awaits. In the aftermath, echoes of lost brilliance remind us that darkness can strike unexpectedly, urging justice and remembrance.
That morning, the world they had created together would come to a brutal end. It wasn't until 4 days later, on July 14, 2025, when the routine call for a welfare check would lead to the devastating discovery. No one had heard from Robin and Thomas for days, their friends and colleagues growing increasingly concerned. The door to their home had been left unlocked, a strange omen that something was wrong. The alarm system had been disabled, another sign that something was terribly out of place. As officers stepped inside the home, a cold, unsettling silence hung in the air. The faint smell of something metallic, a scent that would linger in the memories of those who stepped through that door, mixed with the ever-present fragrance of fresh flowers in the hallway. The house, which once hummed with activity and the joy of life, now felt empty, unnervingly still. It didn't take long for the officers to find the bodies. Robin and Thomas were lying motionless on the floor of their bedroom. Their bodies, once full of vitality, now marked the cruel end of their journey. Multiple gunshot wounds had taken their lives, each shot a violent punctuation to their quiet existence. It was clear to those who found them that this wasn't a simple accident. This was murder. The police had arrived too late to prevent the unthinkable, but what followed would reveal even more about the nature of this tragedy. As investigators began to piece together the details, they would uncover a story of betrayal, a cold-blooded killer, and a plot that seemed to have no clear motive. The peaceful facade of Encino would soon be shattered, and a mystery as dark as the wounds left on the victims would grip the city in its hold. But who could have done such a thing? Who could have taken the lives of two people who had touched so many, whose music had resonated in the hearts of millions? And more chillingly, why? The answers, it seemed, were hidden somewhere in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The discovery. The police officers stepped cautiously through the front door, their boots muffled against the thick carpet. The house, once so full of life, now felt like a tomb. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint creak of floorboards beneath their feet. The scent of stale coffee and the faint floral perfume that lingered on the curtains was overshadowed by something far more metallic, the smell of blood, thick and pungent, cutting through the otherwise serene atmosphere. A single lamp flickered weakly in the corner of the living room, casting long shadows across the furniture. The room was immaculate, too perfect, as if it had been frozen in time. Everything in its place. But nothing felt right. The sense of unease that had gripped the officers the moment they stepped inside lingered like a bad omen. They walked down the hall, passing family photos of Robin and Thomas, their smiles frozen in frames, now eerily out of place in the midst of the horror. A soundless tension hung in the air, thickening with every step, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The door to the bedroom creaked open. The officers' eyes locked on the lifeless forms of Robin and Thomas, sprawled across the floor, their bodies still. Blood pooled around them, staining the hardwood floor, a macabre reminder of the violence that had taken place. The sight was chilling. Their hands were frozen in position, their eyes unblinking and empty. Robin Kaye, the woman who had once brought so many to tears with her music supervision, was now motionless, the vibrant energy she once embodied snuffed out in an instant. Her husband, Thomas Deluca, whose music had reverberated through countless studios, lay beside her, his guitar no longer an instrument of creation, but a symbol of the life that had been violently stolen from him. The officers were numb, staring at the carnage. This was no ordinary case. The scene screamed of something personal, something cruel. A random robbery didn't explain this. This was an execution. A cold, calculated act that carried a message. Minutes felt like hours as the officers surveyed the room, their breaths shallow, their minds struggling to process the horror before them. The question that hung heavy in the room was as simple as it was terrifying. Who would do this? At first, it seemed impossible. Robin and Thomas were beloved, respected within the industry and their community. They were not the kind of people who made enemies. But as the police turned over every detail, even the smallest, insignificant things began to raise questions. The unlocked door, the disabled alarm system. Someone had known their routine. Someone had been inside this home before, and that person had come back with deadly intentions. And then, there was the chilling realization that no one had heard a thing. No struggle. No screams. No sounds of terror. Just the quiet, horrifying end to a life that had once been full of love, laughter, and music. It was the kind of death that made you believe in ghosts. A life snuffed out so abruptly, leaving nothing but a haunting silence in its wake. The discovery was only the beginning. The real nightmare had yet to unfold, and the officers knew it. What they didn't know was that this case would unravel into something even darker than they could have imagined. It would lead them to a killer hiding in plain sight, a man with a twisted mind and a dangerous agenda. The stage was set for a pursuit that would unearth secrets no one was prepared to face. The investigation would reveal a horrifying truth. Robin and Thomas had been targeted, not by a stranger, but by someone who had been in their lives for far too long. Someone who had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But who? And what? As the officers processed the crime scene, one thing became crystal clear. This was no random act of violence. This was personal, and they were about to discover just how deep the darkness ran. The investigation unfolds. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting an orange glow over the Encino neighborhood, as the detectives huddled together, surveying the scene. The police were meticulous, sifting through every inch of the house with the precision of a surgeon. Outside, the hum of the city seemed worlds away, but inside that house, it was as if time had stopped, suspended in a haze of violence. Detective Marcus King stood in the doorway of the bedroom, his eyes narrowing as he took in the grisly scene. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of evidence scattered across the room. Nothing about this made sense. The house was immaculate, except for the blood, pools of it, stained into the rich wood of the floor. It was almost as if the killer had tried to make it seem too perfect, as though they were trying to hide something. King's eyes fell on the disabled security system. It was an obvious sign. Whoever had done this knew the couple's habits well enough to disable their security alarm without hesitation. Robin and Thomas hadn't stood a chance. King's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the number. "We've got something," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll be right there." The evidence was still sparse, but the detectives had already begun the painful task of looking deeper into the lives of Robin and Thomas. They weren't just searching for a killer, they were searching for a motive. Why would someone kill two people with no apparent enemies, no obvious reason to harm them? Minutes later, the scene shifted to a sterile police station conference room, the hum of fluorescent lights above mixing with the quiet murmurs of the detectives. The call had been from the tech team. They'd pulled up the security footage. What they found was chilling. Surveillance video from a neighboring property revealed a figure slipping through the back gate of Robin and Thomas's home on the night of the murder. The figure moved with practiced ease, the door swinging open without a sound. It was almost too smooth, like a well-rehearsed routine. They slipped inside and the camera angle cut. The footage didn't show what happened next, but the police had already begun to piece together the chilling events. Whoever had done this had been there before, knew exactly what they were doing. And then came the breakthrough. Hours later, the name that had been on the tip of their tongues was finally confirmed: Raymond Boodarian. He was the one on the video. A 22-year-old man with no known criminal record, Boodarian had somehow inserted himself into the investigation. His name had come up only once before, in a minor altercation at a local club, but nothing that would have raised any alarms. But the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the details became. Raymond Boodarian had worked as a part-time assistant for one of the entertainment companies that Robin had often collaborated with, a fact that sent a cold chill through the detectives. How was it possible that someone who had worked so close to the couple could be behind something so brutal? Had he harbored resentment toward them? Or had something snapped within him? With a name now in hand, the police wasted no time in tracking Boodarian down. It wasn't long before they discovered something even darker, a series of strange social media posts from Boodarian, full of cryptic messages that hinted at mental instability. They were riddled with dark ramblings about betrayal, anger, and vague threats. There was one in particular that stood out. "When you've been ignored long enough, your voice becomes a gun." The detectives knew they were getting close, but they needed one more piece of the puzzle. They turned to Boodarian's social circle, questioning friends, colleagues, anyone who might shed light on his motives. That's when they learned something that made their skin crawl. Boodarian had developed an obsessive admiration for Robin Kaye, a fact that had gone unnoticed by most. According to his coworkers, he had begun showing up unannounced at the offices where she worked. He had grown increasingly withdrawn, his interactions with others becoming more erratic, even violent at times. The last few weeks before the murders had seen his behavior spiral, withdrawn, angry, almost as if he was preparing for something he couldn't control. But it wasn't until they dug deeper into his financial history that the detectives uncovered the motive they were looking for. Boodarian was broke, desperate, and in his twisted mind, he had convinced himself that Robin owed him something, that she had wronged him in some unspeakable way. Maybe it was the lack of recognition, or the rejection he had felt from her. But whatever it was, it had pushed him to the edge. The police found out that Boodarian had been living off a meager paycheck and had grown increasingly frustrated with his lack of success in the entertainment world. In a desperate bid for fame and fortune, he believed that by killing Robin and Thomas, he could somehow gain their wealth, their status, or at the very least, send a message to the industry that had failed him. It was the perfect storm, obsession, rage, and delusion, all culminating in that fateful night. The night when Raymond Boodarian had taken the lives of two people who had never wronged him, but whom he had believed stood in the way of his own twisted dreams. But the question remained, how had he gotten past the security system? And what had driven him to kill without hesitation? The answers, it seemed, were buried in the darkness of his own mind. A mind that was about to be unmasked in the harsh light of justice. The motive and method. The chilling details continued to surface like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered in the dark. As Detective King sat across from his team, the weight of the case pressed down on him. Everything about Raymond Boodarian's life seemed to be intertwined with obsessive tendencies, and the more they learned, the more it became clear that this was no random act of violence. This was the culmination of a twisted obsession, fueled by resentment and delusion. Boodarian had methodically planned the murders, but it wasn't just about killing Robin and Thomas, it was about sending a message. A message to the people he felt had ignored him. A message to the world that he was more than just a shadow in the background of the entertainment industry. That message was delivered with the cold precision of a killer who believed he had nothing left to lose. As the investigators delved deeper into Boodarian's history, the puzzle pieces began to fit together. Boodarian's obsession with Robin Kaye wasn't just a passing infatuation, it was an all-consuming fixation. He had studied her every move, followed her career closely, and had, over the course of months, convinced himself that she owed him something only he could define. It wasn't love, but a perverse sense of entitlement that had taken root in his mind. He believed that if he could make her notice him, if he could force her to acknowledge him, he would finally be seen. He had felt invisible for so long, watching from the sidelines as others succeeded while he remained stuck in a dead-end job. His resentment festered, and that resentment turned into rage. But what really set him off was the financial instability that had begun to consume him. Boodarian had been struggling to make ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck, unable to get ahead despite his proximity to the industry. And he'd convinced himself that Robin, with all her success, had somehow wronged him, that she had taken opportunities from him. Whether real or imagined, it didn't matter. In his mind, she had become a symbol of everything he could never have. And so, the plan began to take shape. Boodarian knew that Robin and Thomas's house was an easy target. He had been inside before, had helped on small, menial tasks for the company that Robin had worked with. He knew their schedules. He knew when they would be at home and when they would be away. He knew their vulnerabilities. The night of the murder, Boodarian slipped through the gate into the backyard, unnoticed, as if it were second nature. He had studied the house so many times that it was like he was walking through a familiar dream. When he reached the back door, he found it unlocked, just as he had hoped. The security system was disarmed, likely by Robin or Thomas themselves, who had no reason to believe they were in danger. He stepped inside. For a moment, there was stillness. The house was dark, quiet. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound that filled the void. But that silence didn't last. Boodarian, his hands shaking with anticipation, moved through the house with the speed of a predator. He didn't want to wait. He didn't want to risk being seen. He found them in the bedroom, Robin and Thomas, peacefully asleep. But he wasn't there to let them live. He had come with one purpose, to end their lives and with it his perceived oppression. He didn't want anything from them but death. The cold metallic glint of the gun in his hand seemed to mock the quiet serenity of the room. Boodarian took aim. He fired once. Then twice. The sound of the shots echoed through the empty house, a sharp, deafening noise that would forever be etched in the minds of those who would later hear it. The couple didn't stand a chance. They were gone in seconds. But Boodarian wasn't done. He needed to make it seem as if he hadn't been there at all. He staged the scene with deliberate care. The house was left in its pristine state, no signs of struggle or forced entry. It was as though Robin and Thomas had simply gone to sleep and never awoke. He thought it would be enough to confuse the police, to make them question what had truly happened. But there were cracks in his plan. The disabled alarm system was the first giveaway. The house, perfectly intact except for the blood, painted a picture of something more personal than a robbery gone wrong. A stranger wouldn't have known how to disable the security system. Someone close to Robin and Thomas had been in that house before. Someone who had been watching them. As Boodarian walked away from the crime scene, he thought it was over. He believed he had won, that his moment of recognition had finally come. But as the police started to piece together the evidence, the cracks in his story began to widen. What he hadn't anticipated was the investigation itself. The footage from the nearby surveillance camera showed him entering the house like a shadow, with no struggle or confrontation. The police were quick to identify him, and soon, his face was plastered on every news station in the city. But even with the mounting evidence, Boodarian's twisted mind couldn't grasp the consequences of his actions. His arrest came soon after, but he was far from the cold, calculating killer the investigators had hoped to face. When they finally apprehended him, he was unresponsive, staring blankly at the walls of his apartment, as though trapped in a world of his own. But even as he sat there in his jail cell, one thought gnawed at him. Had he truly gained what he had wanted? Or had he merely destroyed the very thing he had coveted? He had taken their lives, but in doing so, he had only exposed the emptiness within his own. And now, his fate was sealed. The trial was inevitable, but for Boodarian, the consequences of his actions would never truly make sense. In his delusional world, it had never been about killing Robin and Thomas. It had always been about making the world notice him. And in the end, the world did. But not in the way he had hoped. In the darkness of his cell, all he could do was wait for his trial. The legal proceedings. The courtroom was cold, the kind of sterile, emotionless space where justice was meant to be served, yet there was something heavy in the air that day. The walls seemed to absorb the tension, as if the room itself could sense the gravity of what was about to unfold. The trial of Raymond Boodarian, the man accused of the brutal murders of Robin Kaye and Thomas Deluca, was set to begin, and the eyes of the world were watching. Detective King sat in the front row, his eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest as he watched the defendant. Boodarian sat motionless at the defendant's table, his eyes hollow, vacant. It was hard to read his expression, but it was clear from the way his shoulders slumped that he was already defeated. The sense of entitlement, the rage that had once driven him, seemed to have evaporated in the harsh light of the courtroom. But there was no mercy for him here. The prosecution team stood ready, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were about to prosecute one of the most horrific cases they had ever seen. Assistant District Attorney Monica Harris was calm, collected, and her eyes held a fierce determination as she prepared to present the evidence. "Your Honor," she began, addressing the judge, "what we have here is not a case of a random robbery gone wrong, but the deliberate, calculated execution of two innocent lives. Robin Kaye, a respected figure in the entertainment industry, and her husband, Thomas Deluca, were not only murdered, they were chosen, targeted by the defendant for reasons that are both disturbing and tragic." The courtroom was silent, each word hanging in the air like a blade. Harris continued, her voice steady. "The evidence points directly to Raymond Boodarian. He was the one who entered their home. He was the one who shot them, and he was the one who left the scene with no intention of being caught. And yet he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the tenacity of the investigation." Boodarian's gaze remained blank, unblinking, his hands trembling ever so slightly. He seemed disconnected from the reality of the moment, as though his mind had drifted far from the courtroom. Harris turned toward the jury, her voice growing stronger. This was not an act of self-defense. This was not an accident. This was a premeditated murder, and the motive was simple: obsession. Raymond Boodarian's twisted fixation on Robin Kaye, his sense of entitlement, and his desire for recognition drove him to take two lives, all in an attempt to force his way into a world he believed he was owed. The evidence was damning. Surveillance footage, interviews with Boodarian's friends and colleagues, and the harrowing details of the crime scene all painted a picture of a man consumed by delusion and rage. The defense, however, had a different strategy. Boodarian's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Robert Foster, rose from his seat, his expression sympathetic. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice gentle, almost too kind, "what we are dealing with here is a young man who was not in control of his actions. Raymond Boodarian was not himself when he committed these heinous acts. We will show that he was suffering from a severe mental health crisis at the time, an untreated condition that clouded his judgment and led him to believe that murder was the only solution." Foster's words hung in the air like a chilling counterpoint to the prosecution's case. Raymond did not wake up that night intending to kill anyone. He was a young man struggling with depression, with anxiety, and with an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. His fixation on Robin Kaye was a symptom of a much deeper psychological issue, one that, tragically, spiraled into violence. The defense team had brought in psychological experts who would testify that Boodarian had suffered from delusional thoughts, and that his obsession with Robin had been exacerbated by untreated mental illness. They would argue that he had not fully understood the consequences of his actions, that he was not in his right mind when he pulled the trigger. It was a compelling argument, but the prosecution wasn't swayed. Harris countered with a pointed remark. You may wish to paint Raymond Boodarian as a victim of his own mind, but the fact remains, he knew what he was doing. He planned this. He stalked his victims. He knew how to disable the security system. He knew how to enter the house without detection. He knew how to kill. And he did it without remorse. As the trial progressed, the jury listened intently, taking in every detail, every twist in the narrative. The defense's attempt to portray Boodarian as a mentally ill man who had been driven to madness by his emotions was met with skepticism. But there were those in the courtroom who were not so sure. Boodarian's mental state remained a focal point throughout the trial. The defense experts spoke of his history of anxiety and depression, and his apparent inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality during the days leading up to the murders. They described his behavior as erratic, his thoughts fragmented, and his obsession with Robin Kaye as a delusion that had taken root in his mind and consumed him entirely. But the more the jury heard, the more it became clear that Raymond Boodarian was not the helpless victim the defense wanted him to be. His actions, his planning, his cold execution of the murders, spoke of a man who had, at the very least, been aware of what he was doing. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven not by a fleeting moment of madness, but by a deep-seated desire for fame, recognition, and revenge. It was a dangerous cocktail that had led him to murder, and now he was going to pay the price. The defense's final attempt to secure a lesser sentence was to argue for an insanity defense. They wanted the jury to see Boodarian as a broken man, someone who had simply lost control. But the prosecution remained steadfast, arguing that while Boodarian may have been disturbed, he was not insane. He had known what he was doing. As the closing statements loomed, it was clear that the jury would have to make a difficult decision. Would they convict Boodarian of first-degree murder, or would they take the more compassionate route and declare him insane? For now, the fate of Raymond Boodarian hung in the balance, and the courtroom waited for the final verdict that would bring justice to Robin Kaye and Thomas Deluca, or fail to deliver it entirely. Community and industry reactions. The days following Raymond Boodarian's arrest and the beginning of his trial were marked by a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Encino, a neighborhood that had once hummed with the laughter of friends, the ringing of phones, and the joy of two lives well lived, now felt like a ghost town. The homes seemed more distant, the streets quieter, as if the entire community had collectively held its breath since the moment the murders had been discovered. News outlets and social media exploded with coverage. Robin and Thomas's deaths became more than just a headline. They became a symbol of something darker. How could someone who had been so close to the music industry, to the heart of entertainment, turn so monstrous? The people who had worked with Robin, who had shared moments of laughter and creativity with Thomas, found themselves asking the same question. A vigil was held in their honor just a week after the discovery, the glow of candlelight flickering against the backdrop of the same palm-lined streets that had once been their sanctuary. The public came to pay their respects, fans, colleagues, even those who had only known them through the television screens. The air was thick with grief, but also with disbelief. How could two lives, so intertwined with the magic of music, come to such an abrupt and violent end? Robin Kaye's colleagues from American Idol, where she had worked for years as the music supervisor, were especially shaken. The news that such an iconic figure in the industry had been taken so violently sent shockwaves throughout the entertainment community. They remembered her not only as a professional but as someone who cared deeply about the artists she worked with, someone who championed the underdog, the ones who were sometimes overlooked. Robin wasn't just the music supervisor. said one of the producers during a tribute on a morning news show. She was the glue that held it all together, that ensured every performance was not just heard, but felt. She made sure every voice mattered, whether you were the next big star or just someone with a dream. As the days passed, the public sentiment began to grow even darker. The tragedy of Robin and Thomas's deaths was a reminder that even in a world of glitz and glamour, darkness lurked beneath the surface. The question wasn't just why someone would kill them, but how such a monstrous crime could have gone unnoticed. How had Boodarian gone undetected for so long? How had his obsession with Robin festered unchecked? Industry insiders began to speak more openly about the pressures of the entertainment world. The industry's brutal, often isolating nature was no secret, but the magnitude of how it could push someone to the brink was only now beginning to be understood. There was talk of mentorship programs, of creating better mental health resources for those who worked behind the scenes, the unsung heroes like Robin who kept everything running smoothly. But even as the industry reacted, the question remained, could anything have been done to stop this tragedy? Boodarian's behavior before the killings began to come into sharper focus. He had once been a part-time assistant at a music agency, where Robin had worked closely with other production teams. According to interviews with his coworkers, he had been known to linger around the office, often showing up unannounced, and on occasion, making others uncomfortable with his incessant need to be in the spotlight. But no one had ever suspected that his infatuation with Robin would lead to something this horrific. His former colleagues, who had seen his unassuming demeanor on the surface, now questioned whether they had missed signs of deeper instability. It was a haunting feeling, one that seemed to grip many who had once been in his orbit. Did they miss the red flags? Had anyone tried to intervene, or was it all too subtle, too hidden beneath the mask of a seemingly harmless young man? And then there was the growing concern about the security lapses that had allowed Boodarian access to the Kaye Deluca home. The disabled alarm system, the unlocked door, all of it pointed to someone who knew the couple's habits well, who had been inside their home before. It raised unsettling questions. Had he been watching them for weeks, perhaps even longer? What kind of person would let that obsession fester, knowing that one day it would boil over into something catastrophic? While the media buzzed, the pressure to find answers mounted. The case had captured the attention of not just the local community but also of people across the country. Robin and Thomas weren't just victims. They had been beloved figures in an industry that shaped millions of lives. Their deaths had left a void, not only for their families but for an entire culture that had come to rely on the entertainment industry for connection, for joy, for escape. In an emotional segment aired on national television, one of the American Idol contestants who had worked with Robin shared a message. She was more than just a supervisor. She was a friend, a mentor, the heart of what we did. I don't know how we'll move on from this, but we will remember her, for her kindness, for her spirit, for the way she cared. As the trial continued, the reactions only deepened. The entertainment community rallied in grief, but also in resolve. They knew that the trial of Raymond Boodarian was just one part of the story. The real challenge lay ahead, in healing, in finding a way to ensure that no one else would fall through the cracks in the same way he had. It was a tough, uncomfortable realization, that even in an industry built on collaboration, it was all too easy for one person to slip through the cracks and destroy everything in their wake. And so, as the days passed and the legal proceedings continued, the people who had been touched by Robin and Thomas's work began to ask themselves how they could ensure that their legacy would be honored. It was more than just paying tribute. It was about ensuring that no one else had to suffer the way they had. Because in the end, it wasn't just about justice for Robin and Thomas, it was about creating a world where such tragedies didn't have to happen at all. The courtroom buzzed with an energy that felt heavy, suffocating, as Raymond Boodarian's trial neared its final stages. The prosecution had laid out its case clearly, calculated murder driven by obsession and resentment. The defense had painted a portrait of a young man caught in the throes of mental illness, unable to understand the gravity of his actions. The jury, a group of strangers brought together by fate, now held the power to determine Boodarian's future. In the hushed silence of the room, Boodarian sat motionless at the defendant's table. His eyes, still vacant, seemed to stare into a world only he could see. The trial had become an exhibition of his mind, twisted, fractured, and disturbed, but the man in front of the jury was not the person who had planned and executed 2 brutal murders. The man in front of them was a reflection of the damage caused by that plan. And now, as the final closing statements were made, it was clear that Boodarian's fate was no longer in his hands. Detective Marcus King, who had been part of the investigation from the very beginning, sat in the front row, his jaw clenched in anticipation. He had watched the evidence unfold, seen the twisted path Boodarian had taken, and felt the weight of the family's grief hanging like a dark cloud over the proceedings. For King, this was not just a case, it was personal. Robin Kaye and Thomas Deluca were not just names on a report. They were people, human beings whose lives had been taken by someone who had no right to take them. Outside the courthouse, the world waited. News outlets, social media, and television stations covered the trial every day. The public, gripped by the brutal nature of the crime, was eagerly awaiting the verdict. But for those who had known Robin and Thomas, the verdict wouldn't change what had happened. It wouldn't bring them back. It wouldn't heal the wounds left in the wake of their deaths. It wouldn't erase the painful truth that one person's obsession had destroyed so much. The weeks leading up to the final verdict were filled with a mounting tension, a waiting game that seemed to stretch on endlessly. It was in the quiet moments that the reality of the situation began to set in. There would be no closure, not truly. Justice, in its purest form, could never bring back what was lost. It could never erase the trauma of that night or the pain that had followed. As the jury deliberated, those who had been closest to Robin and Thomas gathered together in quiet reflection. The entertainment industry, still reeling from the shock of losing one of its own, slowly began to heal. Robin's colleagues from American Idol continued to honor her memory, keeping her legacy alive through the work she had done, the lives she had touched, and the countless artists she had helped shape. But no one could forget the way she had been taken from them so violently, and no one could escape the stark truth that in a world that had given her so much, it had also ultimately betrayed her. Thomas Deluca's legacy as a musician, too, was cemented. His music lived on in the echoes of his guitar, in the notes that filled the hearts of those who had ever heard him play. But just as with Robin, his death had left a hole in the hearts of those who had known him, those who had shared moments of music and laughter with him. For Detective King, the aftermath of the trial was a bittersweet reminder of the cost of justice. Boodarian's fate was sealed, but it didn't fill the void left by the couple's deaths. It didn't change the fact that a man's obsession had taken everything from 2 innocent people. Justice, in the end, was a bitter pill to swallow, and for King, the echoes of the case would linger long after the gavel had fallen. The trial had come to a close, and Boodarian was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury, after deliberating for days, had seen through the defense's claims of mental illness and found that he had been fully aware of the consequences of his actions. The decision was final. Raymond Boodarian would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But even as the judge pronounced the sentence, a part of the courtroom seemed to exhale, almost as if it had been holding its breath for years. Justice had been served, but it was clear that nothing could truly repair the damage that had been done. Robin and Thomas were gone, and no sentence would ever bring them back. As the courtroom emptied and the world moved on, there was a lingering question that haunted everyone involved. What had driven Boodarian to this point? Was it truly mental illness? Or was it a reflection of something darker, a twisted combination of obsession, resentment, and rage that had festered in the shadows until it could no longer be contained? The answer, perhaps, didn't matter as much as the tragedy itself. What had been lost could never be reclaimed. And so, as the sun set over the quiet streets of Encino, a sense of finality hung in the air, bittersweet and unresolved. The story of Robin Kaye and Thomas Deluca was no longer just a crime to be solved. It was a haunting reminder that even in a world of fame and fortune, darkness could take hold in the most unexpected of places. The world would move on, but their memory, their story, would never be forgotten. It would live on in the music, in the lives they had touched, and in the hearts of those who had loved them. Because in the end, even in death, Robin and Thomas had left behind a legacy far greater than any act of violence could ever take from them. As the verdict was handed down, and the courtroom emptied, A chilling thought lingered in the air, unanswered. What if this was just the beginning? What if, behind the mask of the perfect crime, there was something far more sinister? An orchestrated plan so meticulous, so calculated, that no one had yet seen the true depth of the darkness that had driven Boodarian to commit murder. What if there were others out there, waiting in the shadows, their intentions as deadly as the one who had brought this tragedy to light? Could it be that the case of Robin Kaye and Thomas Deluca wasn't the end, but merely a prelude to a series of shocking revelations that could shake the very foundation of what we thought we knew about this world? As the final curtain falls on this tale of obsession, betrayal, and murder, we are left with a question that haunts us all. What other dark secrets are waiting to be uncovered? The next chapter in this twisted tale is far from over. Stay tuned, because the truth is far more sinister than you could ever imagine. If you found this story chilling, mind-blowing, and gripping, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more bone-chilling true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Share this with others because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next.